Ladies and gentlemen, he talks a lot about Mr. Tutherow, whose knife was found at the scene with his fingerprint on it. Didn't have the victim's blood on it. Didn't have any of that type of DNA. And Mr. Lipton suggests apparently that's the person we should have prosecuted. And think about me coming in here as an assistant district attorney and asking the good people of Marion County to convict somebody of murder when a state probation officer testifies under oath at the time of the homicide he was with me 2.5 hours away. We're not talking about his mama coming in, or his girlfriend, or his wife, or his sister, some other kinfolk, or his drinking buddy. We're talking about a state probation officer, Stephen Collins, who you heard, who said on May 17th he showed up late. He was in Jacksboro, Tennessee, which is, I think he said, well, it's 2 hours to Knoxville or whatever it is. It's a long ways away. Tutherow could not have committed this crime. And the reason they argue him is they want you all to go back in that jury room, to use the country expression, they want you to run rapids. Well, there was a knife in there with Tutherow's fingerprint. He must be the killer. Let's ignore all the DNA evidence that points to the defendant. And he talks about how someone would act after committing a terrible, gruesome murder. Well, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, there's no proof in this record as to how someone should act after doing such a heinous crime. She apparently looked happy that night when they took her picture, but there's no proof. There's nothing we can show you. This is how people act after they kill somebody. He talks about the knife. She had the big knife in her possession. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that doesn't mean the knife went to the crime scene. That just means she had the knife in her possession. Why the little knife was used, we don't know. But the little knife had the evidence on it. Some years back, my wife, who insists occasionally I read literature, as opposed to usual stupid stuff I read, had me read a book by Wally Lamb. The title is I Know This Much Is True. And I think about that a lot handling these cases, because when you go back to the jury room, what do we know is true? Well, we know, first of all, the wounds to Jerry Ridge were 2 wounds. We know that he was stabbed in the neck, which severed his jugular vein, which, as Dr. Deering said, would bleed at a pretty good rate. Wouldn't be spurting like an artery, but he would be bleeding steadily. We know that Jerry Ridge was shot in the arm, and it was the shot hit the bone and shattered the bone. In all likelihood, severed the vein and the artery that runs up the arm. We know that happened. And we know, ladies and gentlemen, that the fire that was started in that pawn shop originated with the body of Jerry Ridge. That's how the fire started. We know this is true. That's what the experts have told you. And the guns that were recovered out of the bed of her pickup truck, the bag of guns I like to call it. All of those guns, except the BB gun, are reflected in the federal firearms book. And ladies and gentlemen, we know that she had cuts on her hands. Those are all things that you can take back to the jury room, and you know those are accurate facts. We talk a lot about DNA. In an opening statement, Mr. Lipton said DNA is confusing. And to some extent, I agree with that. I don't really understand DNA. I'm a history major, married to a biology teacher. She understands it a lot better than I do. But ladies and gentlemen, you heard Special Agent Berge tell you about her testing and her analysis of DNA. And Mr. Lipton wants to talk about the crime scene. Well, they didn't call the BCRT for a few hours. And people were in and out. And I think the leap he wants you to make is that if firefighter Todd Brown or Chad Johnson or Matt Blancett walked in there, that they carried Angela Kilgore's DNA into the crime scene and got it on the bloody glove. Does that make any sense whatsoever? There are two areas I want to start out with that tie her to this crime. And first of all, at Valley Pawn Shop, the evidence found at the scene, and that's human hemoglobin. And keep in mind with the DNA testing, Mr. Lipton wants to talk about the truck. Well, they tested the DNA. And of course, in y'all's vehicles, your DNA is going to be there. But what did Agent Berge test? She tested the areas where she found blood. She didn't test the steering wheel to see if it was who was the driver. She tested the areas where they found blood. And the same thing is true here. She tested, you saw the pictures, the blood on the glove, which came back to the victim, Jerry Ridge. And she's tested the non-stained swab. And that DNA matched Angela Kilgore. And that is found at the scene of this crime. And that evidence, ladies and gentlemen, ties this defendant to the murder of Jerry Ridge. And also at Valley Pawn Shop, we have the Zippo lighter fluid can. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, 2 days later, when these officers find her at Foster Falls, what do they find in her truck? Lo and behold, they find another Zippo can. But at the scene of this crime, first of all, we have Jerry Ridge's blood on there. She's a major contributor to the blood, and the stain in the front is a mixture of DNA, including this defendant. That is not confusing evidence, ladies and gentlemen. That is evidence that ties this defendant directly to the murder of Jerry Ridge. Evidence away from the crime scene. May the 17th. What's she got on? She's got on the brown boots. When they take her into custody 2 days later, she's got on the brown boots. And what did Agent Berge tell you? She tested for the presence of blood. And she found Jerry Ridge's DNA on her boots in several places where the blood stains were. That is evidence that ties her directly to the murder of Jerry Ridge. Also, ladies and gentlemen, the knife, the 3-bladed knife. May not be your first choice. You had the big knife or the little knife, but that's the knife that was used. Jerry Ridge's blood is on that knife. She tested the reddish-brown stains, identified them as blood, they're positive for blood, and it's Jerry Ridge's blood. And that knife on May the 19th is in her possession. And Mr. Lipton wants to say, oh, the Tuther Road knife, which tested negative for everything except his fingerprint, who was 2.5 hours late, that's the murder weapon. No, ladies and gentlemen, that is the weapon that killed Jerry Ridge, or contributed to his death. Those are items that she has in her possession. There's other items, ladies and gentlemen. The truck. Her blood is on the belt buckle. We're not talking about epithelial cells. We're talking about blood. When Agent Berge went through that truck, she finds the presence of blood on the driver's seat belt buckle. She also found a red blood stain near the rear passenger door. And who does that tie to? Jerry Ridge. So her truck has her blood in it, which is consistent with the injuries that you saw in the pictures to her hands, and it's got the blood of Jerry Ridge. Again, that ties her directly to this crime. There's more evidence that came out of that truck. The bag of guns in the back of the truck, they came from the pawn shop. And the shirt. The shirt, again, Agent Berge tested the shirt for the presence of blood, and what did she find? She found blood, and who did she match that blood to? The victim in this case. And that's in the front seat of her truck. And the gun, one of the guns out of the bag of guns, human hemoglobin. That came from the defendant. That was in her possession, stolen from the pawn shop. And that's got blood on it. And ladies and gentlemen, it is a great stretch that she's cut during the course of robbing and killing Jerry Ridge. And as she's collecting the loot, she gets the blood on the guns. All these are items that are in her possession. And on May the 17th at Whitwell PD, she's got the cuts on her hand. She's got the laceration over here. All of which are consistent with her having been in some sort of a fight with Jerry Ridge involving a knife. And she got cut during the course of this. And that's the night of this crime, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, it's hard to hide a big red truck. But you can take the Confederate license plate off the front 2 days later. If you recall, the decals that were in the back window were gone, and the state would submit she did that in an effort. It's hard to hide a big red truck, but this at least was a step towards concealing her identity and trying to get away with this crime. She took those steps, ladies and gentlemen. And the especially aggravated robbery count, what she is accused of taking in the indictment are the guns. And of course, we've heard some comments from Mr. Lipton about the money. Mr. Ridge wrote a receipt that afternoon for $4,000. Mr. Sharp testified that Mr. Ridge normally would have had anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000. There was no cash found at the pawn shop. But all of these guns in this bag, plus the one in the duffel bag with the Glock, are reflected in the Federal Firearms License Book. They all came out of the pawn shop. They came out of the pawn shop on May the 17th when she killed Jerry Ridge and robbed him. Ladies and gentlemen, that is an especially aggravated robbery. Used a deadly weapon. We know he was cut. He was shot. And she took some. That is an especially aggravated robbery. And he suffered serious bodily injury. The most serious bodily injury you can have. He died. She's also charged with aggravated arson for setting the place on fire with Mr. Ridge in there. And praise the Lord for the comfort of this family. He was dead when, as Dr. Geary says, the thermal injuries happened. But she's in there pouring Zippo lighter fluid on him and setting him on fire. Why did she do that? She did it to try to cover up the crime. And that's part of Judge Ash's instructions to you. This woman, after stabbing him and shooting him, the poor man's dying or dead, then she sets him on fire to try to cover up what she did. And she's in there wearing the gloves. You know, she tells people in the afternoon, I've got the gloves on for poison oak, but at night when she goes into the raceway, she doesn't have the gloves. When they photograph her later that night, she doesn't have the gloves. And the reason for that, the gloves are back at the pawn shop. Ladies and gentlemen, first-degree murder happens two ways. As we told you when we began this, if you convict her of both premeditated and felony murder, those convictions would merge. But look at the elements, or look at what places her at this crime, the things that you can rely on to convict her. The DNA evidence in this case places her at Valley Pawn. She is at the crime scene. The victim's DNA is on the knife in her possession. The victim's DNA is on the boots that she is wearing. The victim's DNA is in the blood in her truck. And it goes on, ladies and gentlemen. There's this huge volume of DNA evidence. Mr. Lipton wants to say, oh, there's transfer DNA. Okay. The knife, the boots, the truck, the Zippo lighter can. No, ladies and gentlemen, that's not what happened. She started the fire and she had the guns. And ladies and gentlemen, thinking about this case, and looked a lot of the picture of her on May the 17th of 2016. This is taken 11:30, 12 o'clock. Fire was called in at 4:51. Jerry Ridge was no longer in this world. And there she is at the pawn shop, or at the police department. My boss, who's been a prosecutor for a long time, grew up in East Tennessee. And he talks about the old country expression, if you call the tune, you got to pay the fiddler. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is the two people involved in this case in the evening of May the 17th. She's at Whitwell PD. Jerry Ridge, at his place of business, shot, stabbed, and burned. Ladies and gentlemen, the proof in this case is in. She begins his trial with a presumption of innocence. We end this trial with proof beyond a reasonable doubt that this defendant, with premeditation, killed Jerry Ridge. That she killed him in the course of a robbery. That she robbed him, especially aggravated robbery. She used a weapon and she killed him. She burned his business. And she stole from him. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for Angela Kilgore to pay the piper. We ask you to convict her on all counts. Thank you.